may possibly think that this is an opportunity for regime change. Within Israel, there are those who are fatigued that there is little economic activity that is taking place in different parts of Israel. We know that Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv is almost out of commission or is under constant danger. A number of airlines are no longer flying to Tel Aviv. So all these factors conjoined is sending an unequivocal message to the players that diplomacy should be given its pride of place. As to whether that will happen is another debate. But I would want to imagine, as other commentators are saying, that it is critical that the United States of America enters into the arena of diplomacy because they had initiated these negotiations, that if indeed they did so, then there would be a ceasefire, and that would create an environment where the parties who are actively in the theater of war .
This is the journey to one Africa.
The situation between Israel and Iran is one that poses very many questions and does not lend itself to easy answers, and in my view must be situated in the context of history. If you look at Iran, the Iran that we know now, we've got to go back to the 1920s when the Reza Pahlavi family became the dominating dynasty, until the Reza Pahlavi was removed in 1941 by the Allied powers, the British and the Soviet Union, for being not willing to do their bidding. But he was then succeeded by his son, Mohammad Shah Reza Pahlavi, who liberalized Iran in many ways and who was very compliant with the West. And of course, that then led to the emergence of the Ayatollahs, and culminating in the 1979 emergence of the Ayatollahs and the abolition of the Pahlavi dynasty. And something begins to happen at that time, because the Ayatollahs come in with a theocratic regime which clearly states that they do not recognize the state of Israel, and that in fact the state of Israel must be wiped off the surface of the earth. And they say that this Zionist regime must actually go. So that is the official stated position of the Iran regime, or the Tehran regime. And the fact that then they started enriching uranium, almost reaching weapon-grade enrichment, then raised alarm, particularly in the United States of America and in Israel. And the argument that is being put forth by the Netanyahu regime is that they have credible evidence, or that they had credible evidence, that the Iranians had crossed the red line in terms of enrichment, and that they cannot allow the regime to have a nuclear weapon. It is instructive that at the time when the attack on Iran took place, there was a diplomatic effort, or there were diplomatic efforts which were being mediated in Saudi Arabia and within that particular environment, with a view to convincing the Iranians that they ought not to use the uranium for non-peaceful purposes. And to the casual observers, like all of us, we thought that they were going on very well. At least when you listen to the President of the United States of America, one took the view that the negotiations would give birth to a result which would be acceptable to all, and the International Atomic Energy was supervising. But for some reason, in what in the eyes of many appears to be a unilateral decision by the Israelis, but what we now know, had the nod of the United States of America, there is a conflagration which has resulted in a tit for tat and which is affecting populations. We have seen in the last one week the Israelis saying that they now have air domination over the whole of Tehran. We have seen the use of hypersonic missiles which have hit Tel Aviv and have hit Haifa. And for the first time, we see a disruption of normal life in Israel, which had not taken place during the conflict in Gaza, and even when the Houthis were launching their ballistic missiles from Yemen. The question is, should the world be worried? Yes, the world should be worried. The world should be worried because there is a powder keg. What one fears is that if indeed you are to hit some of the bunkers where the enriched uranium is stored, what would be the impact in terms of the pollution that would take place? Who else will be drawn into the conflict? Remember that the Tehran regime has a satellite or what one would call client organization that work with it or work for it. You talk about the Houthis, and that is in Yemen. You talk about the Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. What will they do? And one can also not discount what is being heard in the grapevine, that the North Koreans have said, we are ready to help. The Chinese are also said to be said, we are ready to help, even if it is in a subterranean manner. And the United States of America thus far has not entered into the conflict directly, but we know that their military assets are moving closer and closer to the theater of war. So if those are the early signs of a war that is big, of course, I'm one who is slow to use the term world war, but there are those who are already saying that these are the early signs of a third world war. But I would be much more hesitant because one can see that there are voices in different parts of the world that are calling on Israel and calling on Iran to step back and ask themselves what value is going to be achieved if the conflagration continues in the manner that it is. But as the saying goes, the jury is still out, there is a tit for tat, and there are internal contradictions, both in Israel and in Iran. In Iran, there are segments of the population who are anti the theocratic regime of the Ayatollahs, and they possibly think that this is an opportunity for regime change. Within Israel, there are those who are fatigued that there is little economic activity that is taking place in different parts of Israel. We know that Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv is almost out of commission or is under constant danger. A number of airlines are no longer flying to Tel Aviv. So all these factors conjoined is sending an unequivocal message to the players that diplomacy should be given its pride of place. As to whether that will happen is another debate. But I would want to imagine, as other commentators are saying, that it is critical that the United States of America enters into the arena of diplomacy because they had initiated these negotiations, that if indeed they did so, then there would be a ceasefire, and that would create an environment where the parties who are actively in the theater of war would reassess their positions going forward. You know, it is a very complex situation. I have had an argument being put forth that the Iranians were going on with enrichment, all the negotiations notwithstanding, that the Iranians were not responding to the ultimatum that was given by the United States of America, and the President of the United States of America has actually said we gave them 60 days, and it's on the 61st day that we saw Israel did do what they did. And further, it is also being said that they were engaged in proxy activities through the Houthis and even through Hezbollah. So what changed? I think a number of things changed, but as one must always do, is to look at the history of it. What is the history of it? That there are geopolitical reasons why the United States of America, which until a few years ago has been the hegemon, would want to ensure that it does not lose its foothold in that region, and that they would not allow a regime which they consider to be rogue in Tehran to have a military that has in its arsenal a nuclear device. So I think that when all these things were assessed, the Israelis must have received the green light. You go and test the waters. And it is also possible that the Israelis, when they entered into this arena, did not imagine that the response would be like it is. And right now, it is, as Shakespeare once said, that they have waded so deep into blood that to go forth is as tedious as to go back. And they find themselves between the devil and the deep blue sea in a catch-22 situation. The question is, what do you do? And that is why I think, therefore, that the voice, for example, of the United Nations, for whatever it is worth, because the United Nations now has become such a weak organization whose resolutions are honored in breach, and other players that are interested in this particular situation. So there are many moving parts in this particular situation. And those parts are such as to send danger signs to America and to Israel, and they could wait no more. But we cannot forget that there are other activities that are going on in the world. One cannot forget that there is activity between Russia and Ukraine. One cannot forget that there are activities within the Middle East, as it is called now. One cannot forget that there is a rising power in China, and that all these factors are also making the United States a little bit worried, and they do not want a clan state, if one may, of a side that is not their own. And remember, at one time, Benjamin Netanyahu is on record as saying that Israel is the largest warship for the United States of America in the Middle East. It is a stationary warship from which you can launch many things and neutralize enemies, real or perceived. And I think that their own assessment must have told them that even internally, the Ayatollahs are very weak, and to weaken them now would lead to a regime change. I think there is appetite for diplomacy in the region. There is fatigue. The populations are tired. And we know that the Russian administration, led by Vladimir Putin, has a soft heart for the Iranian administration. We know that the Chinese have a soft heart for the Iranian administration. We also are aware that the North Koreans have a soft heart for the Iranian administration. If soft-heartedness is equal to being allies, then they are in that region. But we also know, on the other hand, that the state of Israel is almost seen as a pariah state in that neighborhood, and that the only friend they have, real friend if you may, is the United States of America. Because even Europe has been sending very clear messages to Europe, particularly the Portuguese have spoken, the Spaniards have spoken, the French not as loudly as they should, the Germans have historical baggages so they can't speak about and against Israel. And they are sending one message: don't fight wars on too many fronts. You are fighting in Gaza, you are fighting the Houthis, you are fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, you are fighting everybody. You can't do this on too many fronts. Whether those messages, blatant and subtle, are being listened to is a totally different debate. But I think that there is the danger which is being seen by the international community. Already we have seen the impact of this particular conflict on the price of oil. And when you talk about the price of oil, everybody is affected. And we also know that that is a very busy area for shipping. So that in terms of the economic impact, the insurance companies all over Europe are beginning to suffer, and the international value chain and food chain, if you may, is being disrupted. So for all those reasons, you can see that there is appetite to ensure that there is a diplomatic solution. You can see the Saudis are making their voices heard, the Qataris are making their voices heard, and all reasonable commentators are sending one clear message: really, let's not continue with this. It can't be resolved otherwise. The situation in the Middle East, and particularly in the context of what is happening now, is dicey. And it is true that from a military perspective, at the end of this particular exercise, when and if there is a ceasefire, commentators will say, but Israel has won anyway. But it is Pyrrhic victory. The cost of that victory, in my view, will be too high. Too high in what sense? Too high because you live in a neighborhood where everybody wants to strangle you. You live in a neighborhood where you cannot do business with your immediate neighbors. And that is not the kind of neighborhood that one wants. It is already a tough neighborhood, even without the war. But remember now that you have a neighborhood where your internal population, you have Hamas, whether you have killed all their leaders, children and women and families have been wiped out, and they exist for only one reason: revenge. You now have an extended enemy outside 1,000 kilometers away in Iran. You have enemies in Yemen. You have enemies in Saudi Arabia. So it will be, as I've already indicated, a Pyrrhic victory whose cost is too much. And one would have thought, for example, that this was the period for rapprochement, particularly with the new administration in Syria, which administration was already beginning to say that we are going to normalize our relationship with Israel. One would have thought that that would be the direction that the entire Middle East region would take towards Israel. One would have thought, for example, that in the context of the negotiations between Iran and the United States of America, the Iranian administration would have been persuaded to recognize the state of Israel and to drop this approach where they said that they must wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So all those things only tell me one thing, that the cost of victory, however defined by whichever side, is too expensive and will create an environment which will live with us for generations and generations. When you listen, and I'm a keen listener of both Western press and Western commentators, and on the other side, the Eastern, and there is one thing that must always be remembered, that the conceptual West always drives the narrative. The major news outlets that are listened to by most of the world, whether it is Bloomberg or CNN or Radio France or Radio Deutsche Welle or Sky or BBC, have only one narrative, and that narrative is that they are good and bad guys, and that we are the good guys. We are the ones who should define morality for the world. What we say is good, what we say is bad. So when we say that the Russians are bad, then the world should simply say, yes, sir, yes, madam, they are bad, very bad. But they have short and selective memories, because they must remember, in the case of Russia, for example, that in 1990 they say not an inch more. But they have now conveniently forgotten that. They have forgotten it in their spaces of power, in their analysis, in their writings, and they now ask the question, well, where was it written? So they drive the narrative. And it can no longer be denied, for example, that Ukraine is fighting a proxy war. We now know, and there is evidence to demonstrate, and we have listened to the British Prime Minister saying what he says and saying the kind of support that they are going to give it. We have seen the other European powers. Of course, the Romanians have stood out in rejecting what was happening, and they have said, we are supporting this administration. And I have no doubt in my mind that they share intelligence with the Ukrainians. So all those factors must be seen in the historical context, that the world from a Western perspective was always bad guys and good guys, and they are the good guys. And of course, if you don't play ball, then you are the bad guys. Israel, on the other hand, must be seen in the context of the Balfour Agreements in 1900s. And you remember, somebody once said that all the problems of the world are actually traceable to the British. When in 1948, the Israeli state as we know it was created, it would have been easier at that time to actually create two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But the decision was made that they were to create this Jewish state, and we know what happened with the Nakba. And after that, we know the activities that took place leading up to the Oslo Accords, where it was agreed that there would be a two-state solution. The two-state solution is no longer on the table. And Israel has been marketed and depicted as the bastion of democracy in what is otherwise an ocean of feudal monarchies and dictatorships. And therefore Europe, or rather Israel, is seen as this beloved country. And the Israelis themselves have not hesitated to go back to history and to go back to the Torah and say that we are chosen of God. And because we are chosen of God, we are different, we are unique. And because we are unique, we must be treated differently. And America, which has underwritten the state of Israel from its creation in 1948, has reinforced this, so that the Israelis actually believe that they are special. They believe that they can do no wrong. They believe that they are God-guided. So when you are dealing with the people who believe that they are undertaking a divine mission, then the first casualty is logic. And when logic has been sacrificed at the altar of mysticism, then your journey is very short, and your reasoning is also not given any space at all. Your reasoning has the chance of a snowball in hell, and that is where we find ourselves. And lastly, you must also remember that we are dealing with a Western world whose power and influence is diminishing. Like it or not, it may take many years, but the global South is awake, and that global South is saying that the time is now for us to be heard, and heard clearly. The demography of the world is changing. Europe is becoming older, an older population. And they are scared. They are scared. That is from a Western perspective. If you ask many Africans, many in the African continent, they are casting their lot with Vladimir Putin. They are saying that Putin is simply using the same thing that the Israelis do, because the Israelis gave birth to this concept of preemptive defense. It is exactly the same thing that Putin said. I'm defending our country preemptively, because if I don't, we will be attacked sooner rather than later. So the Israelis attacked Iran on the basis of preemptive defense. So, and Nelson Mandela put it very well at one time when he was confronted with this question. He says, these fellows, when they don't want you under your freedom fighter, they call you a terrorist. And yet, the truth is, all freedom fighters are labeled terrorists, because the Western world long recognized if you want to kill a dog, you give it a bad name, then you proceed to kill it. So from where I sit, there is nothing that is happening that is bad from Russia. The only thing is we must agree. War is a bad thing. It is a bad thing because young men and women die. It is a bad thing because everybody suffers, both those who are wronged and those who have committed the wrong. So nobody really wants war. War is last resort. And if you ask any of these war generals, their preferred position is, let us never get to war. But don't listen too much. Let us not listen too much to Western analysts whose only agenda is defined by one thing. We are good, they are bad. And if we say they are bad, say yeah. And we say they are good, agree with us. That kind of approach has no place in the civilized world. You know, the Israeli conflict with Iran and the fact that there is a deafening silence from the West, and which is actually complicit, takes away their high moral stance that they had with regard to the war between Russia and Ukraine. The same arguments are no longer available to them. And in the last 1 week, when the Israelis have been jousting with the Iranians, you no longer hear as loudly as it was that the Russians are bombarding Kiev. In fact, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is no longer occupy acres and acres of space in the newspapers as it was 2 weeks ago, because it has taken away the moral argument that the conceptual West had. And that is why you can see now they are a little bit slow to judge, or even if they are doing so, they are not doing it as loudly and as boldly as they were doing, which is good. It is good because it is creating an environment where, in fact, all combatants, all parties who are involved in conflict can be brought to the negotiating table. It is a bad route to take, but I think it is the route that has been taken. And sometimes there is a storm before the lull. I hope and pray that this storm between Iran and Israel is the storm that will create a lull which will lead to peace. Even if it is merely a modus vivendi, where people live and let live without permanent peace, it will be good for the world to reassess, and to reassess the institutions that were created after the World War II, to look at the UN Charter again, to look at the architecture of the United Nations again. I think for the first time since the World War II, all these institutions are being reassessed. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. All these are now under scrutiny because it would appear to me that the 21st century and the conflicts that have arisen require different approaches going forward. We are fighting at a time where fights are not even, there are no men and women in boots on the ground. Drones have taken space, ballistic missiles. How do you prosecute this war? How do you deal with it in the context of the instruments that we have, which were created after World War II? Many questions, begging many answers, and it will take bold people, bold leadership at the political level to arrive at the desired destination. The question as to what could happen if the Ayatollahs are removed is one that does not lend itself to easy answers. But there are things that tell us how dangerous and how confused it could be. Look at Libya post-Gaddafi. One would have thought that after Gaddafi, then Libya would be El Dorado, the land of gold. We now know and see the confusion. See Iraq after Saddam Hussein. One would have thought that after Saddam, you'd have a regime that responds to the West in the manner that the West wants. See Syria after Assad, and look at the situation. There may be stability in and around Damascus, but what about the rest of Syria? And I dare say that Iran could be a lot more complex because you have people who are inclined toward the theocratic regime, which is Shia Muslim of their own kind. There are people who are remnants of the Pahlavi dynasty. And all these factors which we thought were dead were possibly in a state of comatose. And if they arise and they are armed, we could see in Iran a civil war. We could see in Iran what we are seeing in Afghanistan. Those are the possibilities, those are the scenarios that lend themselves to being taken into consideration if the Ayatollahs were to leave the scene. The Israeli-Palestinian problem is one that must necessarily be situated in history. Since the creation of Israel in 1948, we have always heard the agitation from the Palestinians that what ought to have happened at that time was the creation of two states, but that did not happen. And the world, to mean that part of the world, has seen wars. We remember the Yom Kippur War, we remember the 1973 wars and what happened after those wars, the seizure of Sinai from the Egyptians, the Golan Heights, and of course the West Bank. And that in itself has given birth to many problems over the years, culminating in the Intifada in 1980s. And that was, of course, reignited again on the 7th of October when Hamas crossed Israel, the borders of Israel, and abducted individuals who are still in their custody, some of whom are still in their custody even as we speak. And the Israelis, I think, must have thought that military action would resolve the problem very quickly. But almost 1 year later, the problem has refused to go, with the consequence that the world now talks about a genocide, with the consequence that international institutions such as the International Court of Justice and, of course, the UN, having pronounced themselves on the issue and indicted individuals who are within the high ranks of Israeli polity and, of course, Hamas. But what is now interesting is that the war is becoming wider and wider. Initially, it was being prosecuted against Hamas and geographically was restricted to the Gaza Strip. But we now see the involvement of other organizations which traditionally are aligned to Iran and are aligned to Hamas, such as the Houthi in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the relationship between Hezbollah and Israel is particularly interesting. We remember in the year 2000, in the early 2000s, the Israelis actually had boots on the ground with a view to neutralizing Hezbollah. And when Hezbollah, of course, was defeated, if you may, depending on who you talk to, when the conflict was stopped, there was the understanding that Hezbollah would be disarmed, but they were never disarmed. And they have become an important political player in the Lebanon polity, such that they are in parliament in Lebanon, they are stronger than the regular Lebanese army, and some hold the view that they are also a proxy for the Iranians who have vowed that Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. And as we know now, immediately after the Gaza problem erupted, they said that they would ensure that the Israelis withdraw and they themselves are on a war footing. What has happened in the recent past, which has now escalated into what is essentially a full-scale war, coupled with the pager explosions and the elimination of high-ranking officials, is now opening a completely new chapter. Because when you listen to the Israeli general, they don't want boots on the ground. But we have now seen that quite a number of military targets are being raided by the Israelis. And when one is dealing with Hezbollah, the Israelis have an interesting view. They hold the view that to the extent that Hezbollah uses civilian facilities to host combatants, every other place that is so defined is therefore a legitimate military target. And the fear is that that war may escalate and we may find ourselves in a situation where the war front now changes from the Gaza Strip to the Lebanon front and going beyond southern Lebanon. What is unique about this war is what I think has been the level of preparation of Hezbollah. I think they have been preparing in a very big way, and we have seen some of the drones that they have shown demonstrating that they have infiltrated the Iron Dome and take photographs of military facilities, and some of their rockets are even reaching Tel Aviv. So this is a new chapter that could lead to an escalation, and when it leads to an escalation, it may go beyond Lebanon, it may go into Syria, it may go into Jordan, even if they like it or not. It may, of course, go into Yemen, because the Houthis are active. And that in itself may involve Iran, and one does not know how the allies of Israel in Europe and, of course, the United States of America will be involved. So we are dealing with a powder keg, and it is something that one cannot speculate too much about, but one can say that the ground is changing on a daily basis, and that this is going to be something that, if not mediated in a peaceful manner, may lead to a long-term war in that part of the world. Let it not be lost on us that we have seen shuttle diplomacy by the Americans and the Egyptians and the Qataris, but it appears that diplomacy is not moving the needle in any one way. Because the Israelis say, we've got to neutralize the Hamas. And I think they are now saying, we also have to neutralize Hezbollah, and we also have to neutralize the Houthis. But history has taught us that neutralizing non-conventional armies which operate on the fundamentals of guerrilla warfare is not an easy thing. So the world finds itself between the devil and the deep blue sea. Oh, you know, it's amazing what we are seeing today. I know, for example, of course, the Israelis have not admitted that they were responsible, but it tells you that how a supply chain can be infiltrated through the setting up, as some are saying, of companies which then infiltrate your system, supply you with goods which are themselves loaded with explosives. It tells you that the face of war is changing, that your phone can be a weapon, that the drones as we know them are already weapons. So the face of war is changing in a very dramatic way. And with artificial intelligence, one can imagine what is going to happen on a daily basis. Remember that the military has been the place where new technology is incubated, and the Israelis, using the Mossad, are always ahead of the game in this regard, because they always have their guard up, because for them it is a war for survival. And the theater of war in the Middle East is demonstrating that indeed the face of war is changing, and technology is the new weapon which will be used in a very effective and destructive manner. You know, the situation in the Middle East has always been complex. Complex in the sense that the Israelis, since their creation, has always fought for their survival. And in the knowledge that they are supported by the United States of America and, of course, quite a number of European countries. And there are those within the Palestinian space who are also supported by countries such as Iran. Iran has come out quite clearly, particularly since the 1979 revolution that brought the clerics into power. And their pronouncement has been very clear. And pronouncement is clear in the sense that Iran also sees itself as the country that has the duty to spread Islam of the Shia kind in that part of the world. And this, in some ways, is also a proxy war, turning into a proxy war, where the Iranians, knowing as they do that they don't want to face the United States of America and the West in a theater of war, may very well be using this organization, such as the Houthis or Hezbollah and Hamas, in order to carry out their agenda, whatever it is, against the Israelis. So holding all factors constant, I don't think anybody has the appetite for direct confrontation. The Americans and the Europeans don't have the appetite for confrontation, and of course the Iranians also don't have the appetite for confrontation, so they'll use proxies and a lot of what one may describe as saber rattling so that they don't confront each other. But war, sometimes, as we say in Kiswahili, has no eyes. It takes only one small mistake, and the world could find itself in a situation where the confrontation is direct and deadly, and nobody can predict how that can and will pan out if it ever occurs. But the players know. When you see shuttle diplomacy, it is a statement that people are afraid. No matter how strong they feel, they know that nobody can quite predict the outcome of war and its impact on those who survive it. All wars end with peace, and the history of the world has taught us throughout the ages and in the more recent past, with the creation of the League of Nations and its collapse and the creation of the United Nations in 1945 after the end of the Second World War, it was thought that the UN would be the body that would be in the forefront of dealing with such matters. But we have seen in the war in the Middle East that attempts by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, have not yielded any fruits. We have seen that even intervention by the International Court of Justice, which was moved by South Africa, has not yielded any results. What we are seeing is a world where there are countries which have now made the decision that we are not going to respect any injunction from international bodies. So you find a UN that is neutralized and neutered, and you find a United Nations, or rather United States of America, which is becoming more and more unilateral in its actions, and therefore is no longer a respecter of the decisions of the UN unless those decisions are in its favor. One would have thought that the European Union would also have the appetite for intervening, but you and me know that the European Union is very much in many ways in matters military at the behest of, acts at the behest of the United States of America. One would have thought that even a weak body such as the African Union would have some leverage, but really nobody cares about the opinion of the African Union. One would have thought that China, which is an emerging power, would also bring its weight to bear, but I think China is too cautious. China does not want to annoy or seem to align with any part, so that it is left to the combatants. It's left to Israel in the case of the war between them and Hamas. It is left to the Palestinian leadership to realize that this war is not winnable. And winnable does not mean that military triumph is what defines success or defeat, but to realize that the impact on the population, the impact on the economies is undesirable, must just come out of the leaders. And that is why sometimes one looks forward to the days when there would be direct negotiation that involves the leaders of the combatants, and in that way, you can bring this war to an end. Barring that, it may become a war that goes to the very full length, and ultimately, after there is winner and vanquished, then people will come to their senses. For the moment, I think either side believe that they can win, however they define success, and therefore they will go as long as they are being urged on by their benefactors who sit at the negotiation table and at the same time are supplying them with arms, blowing hot and cold, as it were. A tragic situation when bodies such as the UN are neutered and are no longer useful in mediating peace, the very reason why it was created. I would not myself go out and apportion blame at this stage. I believe that both sides are being supported by their supporters. And remember that the very reason why countries survive is because they want to be protected. So the United States of America also defines its interests, and it's asking herself, what is in the best interest of the United States of America? And I think from American policymakers, their support for the state of Israel has geopolitical significance. And for that reason, they'll do that which is in their best interest. So one can blame them all they want, but they have defined their interests and they are pursuing their interests because they think that that is what is in their best interest. Equally, with the Palestinians, they have their benefactors who think that the creation of a Palestinian state is something that is useful. I personally hold the view that there should be a Palestinian state. In fact, after the Oslo Accords, one would have thought that at that time we would move towards the creation of a two states as the solution to the problem. But all of us now know that the Oslo Accords were honored in breach and that the problem has become much more complex. So apportioning blame is something that we must be very slow to do. Understanding how nuanced that conflict is and understanding that nations act in their best interests for whatever reasons and however they define those interests. The relationship between man and God, particularly in the context of war, is one that is very complex. If you look at the holy books, you look at the Torah, You look at the Christian Bible, you look at the Muslim Quran, war is something that is ever there. So people can claim peace and say many things about peace, but human conflict is inevitable, and many times people ignore religious sanctions and injunctions, and they engage in war anyway. So religion, people use religion as a reason and an excuse for prosecuting war. And people fight in the belief that they are defending their religion. As long as men and women think in that way, religion can be used in different ways to prosecute war and to defend the indefensible. And that has been the history of man and the history of religion throughout the ages.
This is the journey to one Africa.